Israel says it's planning a major military operation in the occupied West Bank. Settler attacks on Palestinians are intensifying and becoming increasingly violent. As Israel is gearing up for an election, how does this escalation serve Benjamin Netanyahu and his far-right partners? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Per Nyberg. The Israeli military has stepped up its operations in the occupied West Bank, storming several Palestinian towns and villages. The government is also fast-tracking the expansion of illegal settlements and outposts. At the same time, Israeli settlers are intensifying their attacks on Palestinians. Well, this escalation is nothing new, but it comes just 3 months before general elections in Israel. Opinion polls suggest Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu could lose power. Land grabs and accelerating the establishment of new illegal settlements sit well with his right-wing support base. We'll discuss with our guests how this latest violence in the occupied West Bank could serve Netanyahu's political ambitions. First, though, this report from Michael Apple.
It's a moment for prayer and reflection as a Palestinian community in the occupied West Bank buries more of its fathers and sons. Killed by Israeli bullets fired by both settlers and the military in a confrontation in the village of Tal that also killed 2 Israeli soldiers.
What's happening in Tel and what's happened in other villages is the result of settler violence. No one is stopping them.
Within hours of the shootings, the Israeli Prime Minister ordered increased military operations in the occupied West Bank, laying siege to Nablus and surrounding areas. Israeli troops even stormed a hospital to arrest and drag off wounded Palestinians. A joint statement from Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense minister's office announced the accelerated legalization of farm outposts and establishment of new ones. All Israeli outposts and settlements are illegal under international law. Settler attacks are a daily occurrence, with the recent UN report finding they increased annually by 130% in 2025.
It's a conflict about changing the demographic. They extend roads, they dig the land. They're trying to impose a new reality. The people are rejecting this totally. The people here were born and raised on the spirit of resistance, and they are still resisting.
Illegal settlements have expanded significantly in recent years, and hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers now live on stolen Palestinian land. With elections just 3 months away, opinion polls suggest Netanyahu's Likud party is struggling. Competition for the right-wing voter base is fierce. Rights groups warn the occupied West Bank is on a knife's edge, with the Israeli military enabling and actively supporting settlers, waging what's being called state-sponsored violence. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Now let's bring in our guests into this conversation. Joining us from Tel Aviv is Alon Pinkas, a former Israeli ambassador and consul general in New York. In the occupied West Bank, Sari Bashi, a human rights lawyer and executive director of the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel. Also in Tel Aviv, Merav Sunshine, a senior analyst at the International Crisis Group, whose research focuses on Israel and Palestine. A warm welcome to all three of you. Sari Bashi, I want to start with you because you're there in the occupied West Bank. How would you describe the atmosphere right now?
It's been bad for a while, and it's getting worse. The context is that for the last few years, the travel restrictions and level of settler as well as military violence have skyrocketed. So it's very difficult to get around, to move from place to place, because most entrances and exits to Palestinian towns have been closed off. So people need to make very long detours, going north for 40 kilometers only to go south for another 40 kilometers to get to where they need to go, when it otherwise would be very quick. Settler attacks have reached the point where now on average every 6 days, 6 times every day, there are settler attacks, and 3 of those on average lead to Palestinians being injured. Sometimes we see worse than being injured. And there's a feeling that both the military as well as settlers are closing in, particularly on Palestinian villages.
What's it like for you raising a family in this kind of environment?
Look, I mean, like any parent, right? I try to protect my kids, and on the one hand, explain to them what they need to know when they see checkpoints, or I usually am able to keep them out of areas that are likely to be friction points with settlers. The settlers are more attacking villages that are close to outposts and settlements. So if you kind of stay out of that immediate area, you have some measure of protection. But it's difficult. It's difficult, and also it's interesting for me to see how quickly my kids can understand concepts that grown-ups struggle to get. So my kids understand that the settlers and the military are pushing at Palestinian areas in order to try to make Palestinians leave. And I think for grown-ups, it gets the story becomes convoluted in a way that actually isn't necessary. It's very simple. There's a very high level of violence, officially by the military, and then unofficially but state-sponsored by the settlers. And the goal is to push Palestinians out of areas that the Israeli government wants to settle. But that narrative can get lost sometimes among grown-ups. For children, it's clear.
Alon Pinkas in Tel Aviv, do you agree with that this is state-sponsored to get the Palestinians to leave?
Yeah, I do. It may not be an official policy. It may not be, there may not be a plan in place. But this is the idea, which is why what we're looking at it as a crisis, as far as the government is concerned, as an opportunity. Now, to be practical, only very few Palestinians are actually going to leave. I mean, this is patently impractical and unfeasible to actually expel a large number of Palestinians. But the government, either by encouraging or by looking the other way, is effectively turning this into a legitimate means or a legitimate policy, and trying to create two things, an irreversible reality on the ground in which settlements and outposts and illegal outposts, call it what you want, these are all euphemisms, and Palestinian villages, towns, and cities are so enmeshed, so intertwined that it would make a Palestinian state not viable, discontiguous, and just impossible to ever implement. And the second is, and I'm sure we're going to get into that later in our conversation, as far as the right wing, or the extreme right wing is concerned, and by the way, Mr. Netanyahu and the extreme right wing are the same. I mean, the distinction is false and artificial. He is exactly, he speaks in less bellicose or less incendiary language than the extreme right wing, but he's doing the same thing. They see it from an electoral point of view, less than 100 years away, less than 100 days away from the election. They see this as an opportunity to create another front. There was Gaza, there was Lebanon, there was Iran, there was Syria, there were the Houthis in Yemen, and now we have the West Bank.
But Alon, let me jump in here. For you as a former ambassador and government official, are you comfortable with this?
Comfortable? I'm anything but comfortable. Absolutely not comfortable. You just heard me say, what I said. Absolutely not comfortable. I think this should. My only regret is that the election is not focused on this. That none of the opposition parties is raising this as an issue.
Merab Zonshine, there was a statement from the Palestinian Foreign Ministry talking about how official Israeli incitement continues to fuel and encourage these crimes. Is that your understanding of the root causes of this violence?
I mean, it is official Israeli policy. This government has a finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, who is also a minister in the defense ministry. He came into this government with a very clear plan. He has made it his mission and has in large part succeeded, not only in accelerating settlements, but in making it clear that he'll do everything in his power to prevent Palestinian state, which means preventing Palestinian territorial continuity, livelihood, movement, access. And that was before October 7th. And after October 7th, it gave all the more legitimacy. He has armed settlers, him and Ben Gvir, the national security minister. So this actually is very much official policy. They talk about Greater Israel. Netanyahu talks about security control from the river to the sea. So it's no longer implicit. It's not something that's hinted at. This is very clear. And then in the media, for example, which can be very critical of Netanyahu, but in the media, they talk about it as if there was a terror attack against Israelis and 2 Israelis were killed. But that's not what happened. What happened was Israeli armed militias in illegal settlements are going and rampaging and vandalizing and harassing and in some cases killing Palestinians. And when they try some kind of self-defense in which they have very little recourse because they don't have arms, they don't have a state, they don't have a police force, then they are immediately incriminated, and then the settler rampages get worse, the IDF incursions get worse. I mean, so it's really astonishing how little recourse they have and how much they are still blamed.
Merab, you heard Alon there saying it's a pity that the election isn't sooner. Do you think that the Israeli public, are they comfortable with this kind of development?
That issue is somewhat nuanced because there's a large sector of Israeli society, the ones who are kind of liberal, secular, inside the center of Israel, who don't go to the West Bank, who don't think about the West Bank, who don't necessarily know what's happening in the West Bank. And the information that they do get is very much filtered through a problematic media that doesn't give them the actual information, as I was saying. So a lot of Israelis just don't want to be troubled by it. Some of them clearly feel like settlements, might be an impediment to a future peace deal. But for a long time, they've just become a consensus. And the far right has filled a vacuum of Israelis who don't know or don't care. And they've led for the last 20 years a policy that is very, very explicit. A different government is not going to necessarily reverse the settlement project. It's very much a national project of over a half a century in Israel. It's also considered by many to be a security issue, even though doesn't provide security in any way. But that's a consensus in Israeli society. On settler violence specifically, though, and on the acceleration of illegal outposts, I think it is possible that a different government could rein that in, if nothing else than because of the international sanctions and opprobrium that it has been getting.
Sari, you heard there that the Israelis are calling this terrorism, what's been happening over in the occupied West Bank. But there was also this statement from the Palestinian Foreign Ministry talking about the escalation of settler terrorism. So both sides are accusing each other of terrorism. Also, the HRW, Human Rights Watch, they have described this as a powder keg waiting to explode. How dangerous is this situation right now?
I think powder keg is a good analogy, a good image, because for the past 2.5 years in particular, there's been an escalation of settler violence. There has been a small but noteworthy contingency of Israelis engaging in protective presence. So these are volunteers who just show up in Palestinian villages so that when settlers come, it'll be less likely that they'll harm Palestinians, including in some cases taking blows from settlers, knowing that it's safer for them to be a buffer because there is a bit of a filter in what a settler will do to an Israeli Jew that doesn't exist for Palestinians. But it's inevitable that at some point Palestinians are going to try to defend themselves as well. And then I worry that we're going to see more incidents like we saw on Friday, because there's no protection. In the villages, the only force authorized to hold guns is the military, and then the settlers who have guns as private individuals. There's no Palestinian police force that is allowed to operate there, and no protection available. Under international law, the army is required to protect Palestinians, and in fact, to safely remove the settlers from the occupied West Bank where they don't have a right to be. But that's not what's happening. So when the army comes to these incidents, it becomes even more dangerous for Palestinians. And when Israeli Jewish volunteers try to call the police to file police complaints against the settlers, they are rejected, phones hung up. There's no recourse for Palestinians. So it's inevitable that people are going to try to defend themselves. And then I worry that we're going to see very violent reactions from the Israeli government. And it's really important for me to say that these settlers are, their violence is state violence. The Israeli government put them unlawfully in the occupied territory. It's unlawful for an occupying power to transfer its civilians into the occupied territory. Even in the outposts that are unauthorized, the Israeli government is providing infrastructure like water and electricity, and most importantly, protection from the army at the expense of Palestinians. So when settlers enter a Palestinian village and engage in violence or harassment against Palestinians, the army will show up and then, more likely than not, either do nothing or participate in the violence and harassment of Palestinians. So there's literally nothing villagers can do. And the last thing I'll say is that we've seen a worrying trend of the Israeli military arresting village leaders who've been organizing the protective presence of volunteer Israeli Jews. In other words, leaders who are trying to find nonviolent options to protect their villages are now finding themselves under arrest and being abused and mistreated in detention.
Alon, Ehud Olmert, the former prime minister, he wrote an opinion piece in Haaretz with the headline, "Israel is conducting a systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing and war crimes or crimes against humanity in the West Bank." And he even called for an intervention by the ICC, referring to what he called Jewish terrorism in the West Bank. Those kind of articles, do you think that they have any kind of effect on the Israeli public?
On the Israeli public, minimal effect, if anything. Right? I mean, either they preach to the converted, or they fall on deaf ears. Mostly, predominantly, they fall on deaf ears. Look, the West Bank is 35 kilometers east from the window I'm looking at when I'm not looking at you. And Israelis conveniently live in complete denial over what's going on there. They haven't been there. They don't care much for the settlers, by the way, but they care even less about the Palestinians, and they care even less than that about this abnormality of the occupation. And they can't fathom, they can't even begin to think what this all means, because, you know, if you don't like the two-state solution and you don't like the idea or concept of a Palestinian state, then your only alternative is a one binational state. There is no in-between. And Israelis just don't realize this, or choose not to think about this. And, you know, excuse the cliche, but denial is not just a river in Egypt. And many Israelis seem to think that it is.
Alon, do you think that Donald Trump has also stopped caring? Because he told reporters in the Oval Office back in September last year, I will not allow Israel to annex the West Bank. Nope, I will not allow it. It's not going to happen. Has he given up on that?
Yeah, he said that because, I don't think he cares much about the Palestinians. I mean, you know, you're looking at a transactional president who's thinking constantly about what's in it for him, for his family, for his investments rather than America. Look, but to be fair to Trump, there hasn't been an American involvement on the Palestinian issue since 2014, since Secretary of State then John Kerry under then President Barack Obama tried to relaunch a peace process, unsuccessfully, obviously. I don't think Trump cares about that. What he does care is what the Saudis tell him, what the Qataris tell him, what the Emiratis tell him, and increasingly what the Turks tell him. that would dictate how he feels about this far more than what Israel says to him, because Israel has very little influence over him, despite the conventional wisdom. So yes, in the next 2 years, given that there's a different government in Israel somewhere in late November or mid-December after the October 27 election, Trump will be willing to cooperate with an Israeli government, but he will not be the one to put on the table a peace plan or a negotiating roadmap. So I wouldn't, if I were Palestinian or Israeli for that matter, which I am, I would not count on Donald Trump's assistance here.
Meirav, can I read a statement to you? It's a joint statement issued by 17 Israeli human rights groups, including Adalah, Breaking the Silence, and B'Tselem. They've issued an urgent call to the international community appealing for immediate action to stop the violence by Israeli settlers and the Israeli army. And these organizations say settler attacks supported by the Israeli army have escalated across the West Bank, and they're calling for immediate pressure to be put on Israel to stop further attacks and to ensure the protection of Palestinians in line with Israel's obligations under international law. Meirav, what kind of pressure do you think that the international community could put on Israel at this point?
Well, we saw some seedlings of that last year during the peak of the destruction of Gaza in Israel, when European countries started to worry about Gaza and were also worried about the West Bank because of the acceleration of the violence that we've seen. And some have taken measures such as sanctions against far-right ministers, sanctions against certain settlers. Of course, Biden did that at the end of his term, and then Trump repealed all of that. And unfortunately, much of what would have an impact has to come from the US. But Europe does have power, and it has power that it doesn't use. The European Union specifically, on the trade benefits that Israel gets. Israel needs the EU, and it would definitely be hurt economically if the EU took those measures. But as we know, the EU has to have a qualitative majority, or in some cases a unanimity, and it's very difficult to achieve that. And Israel has worked very hard to undermine the ability of all EU states to act against it. So there are measures that it can take. And beyond that, I think what's so disappointing is that everyone can see in front of them what's happening, and that it's not just sanctioning a few settlers or a few ministers. It's absolutely overhauling the way that the world treats Israel. Israel is doing international crimes. It's undermining the security of the region. It's violating rights and laws all the time, and everybody knows it. And it still doesn't treat Israel in a way that would be synonymous with its own understanding of its own laws. For example, the International Court of Justice had an advisory opinion in the summer of 2024 where it clearly stated that Israel is violating international law. And some countries like Ireland, who are now enforcing a settlement boycott, are invoking that advisory opinion. So this needs to happen across the board. It needs to happen in a much bigger way. And maybe also cultural and economic consequences for Israelis in Europe would have an effect. But these are things that are just not happening.
Sari, you're an expert in humanitarian law.
Here?
Of course. Sorry, go ahead, Alon.
No, I totally agree and subscribe to everything that Meirav said. I just want to add one thing. You do see in the last 2.5 years a sea of change, even tectonic shifts in world public opinion on Israel. I mean, obviously, the attention goes to these monumental, colossal changes in American public opinion, but you see an increasing worsening of public opinion in terms of Israel's image in Europe. That could translate into all those things that Meirav just mentioned.
I just want to get Sari's opinion here on this ICJ ruling or opinion from 2024 that the Israeli occupation is unlawful and that Israel should bring this unlawful presence to an end as rapidly as possible. What's lacking here? Why isn't this international law working here?
Well, I think, first of all, it's not too late. I think one thing the ICJ opinion made clear is also the responsibilities of third parties. So some of the measures that Meirav mentioned, they're not just foreign policy choices, they're actually legal obligations. So if we take a continent like Europe, whose companies have extensive trade ties with the Israeli government and also with settlements, There's a lot of settlement trade that is happening with Europe, actually in violation of European internal regulations. And by not reining that in, the various European countries are actually putting their own companies at risk for complicity in serious international law violations. And that would extend also to European companies that are providing goods and services that are enabling settlement expansion, that are enabling abuses against Palestinian detainees. We just had some pressure put on a Dutch company that was providing dogs, police dogs, to the Israeli prison services, and those dogs were implicated in some of the worst forms of torture that you can possibly imagine. And so I think a lot could be done if Western countries who have extensive trade ties with Israel would just follow their own rules and protect their own companies by putting in measures that would prevent their own companies from being complicit. And beyond that, as a foreign policy matter, there is a lot that governments can do. And I'm encouraged to see somewhat more willingness on the part of European governments to take measures, including a small number of individual sanctions that were issued against individual settlers. But when the violence is state-backed, the sanctions, the individual sanctions, should extend to government officials who are responsible for this. And that's a step that I think is realistic to ask European governments to take.
Briefly here, Merav, at the very end, we have about a minute left of our time. Just reading these statements from Smotrich. He was talking about how the Palestinian villages should look like the refugee camps in Nablus and Tulkarem, which of course were destroyed. You heard Ben Gvir talking about how the Palestinians are the enemy. What do you think is going to happen at the ballot box in October?
Well, I mean, I think Israelis are sick of Netanyahu, many of them, but not for the reasons that we're talking about, not because of the West Bank and not because of Gaza. They are upset with him about October 7th. They're upset about the far-right government undermining their own democratic mechanisms and the far-right turn. It has very little or if nothing to do with the Palestinian issue. So I think Netanyahu is a political genius. He's been around for a very long time. It's plausible that he'll somehow still be able to block an opposition coalition from forming itself. But I think Israelis do want a change. And I do think that any government that is not this current government, even if it still will have a lot of problems in moving ahead on the Palestinian issue, will be an improvement for especially Palestinians on the ground, but I think for the region as well.
I want to say thank you to our guests, Alon Pinkas, Sari Bashi and Merav Sunshine. Thank you all three for joining us on Inside Story today. And thank you so much for watching. You can, of course, see the whole program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it from me, Prime Nyberg, and the whole team here in Doha. Al Jazeera's coverage continues in just a moment. Stay with us.